And we find ourselves to the second Ayreon album. This time we enter in an actual fantasy of music, coming into one of the stranger albums within the discography, and one that I really can't wait to talk about. So let's not prolong this any longer and get into it.
Sit back and relax.
Actual Fantasy by Ayreon. So I've been going back and revisiting each of his albums. I've already had a look at his first album of The Final Experiment, which brings us now to his second album. Arjen Anthony Lucassen has been teasing us more and more with this latest project that he's putting out. So I decided I'll go with it and I'll actually start reviewing some of his past works. And so we come to Actual Fantasy, his second project. And this guy is probably the most removed out of the overall Ayreon discography for two major reasons. The first of which, it's the only album that doesn't really follow a structured narrative. There's no real characters that are seen throughout the entirety of the album. There's no real cohesive storyline as well. It does tie in a little bit with some of the other albums, which is something that Arjen really likes to do. It still has a concept, at least, within each song being some kind of a either a wish fulfillment or revolving around the universe and the stars and some kind of a fantasy aspect. So it's a blending of fantasy as well as science fiction, and that's kind of been with all of his albums. The other main deviation is there's no women vocalists on this album. On all of his other works, there's always one or two female vocals coming in to harmonize with the male vocals found on here. Here we only find the male vocals vocalizing. Neither of these are really a knock against it, it's just a different approach to the Ayreon brand. Even though this album, when you look at the ratings about this album, has been noted being one of the weaker albums on the bunch, it's not unjustified. I know that some of his works are just groundbreaking and amazing, and this didn't quite come off the same, I guess, level of genius, but that's not to say this album isn't good. In fact, this album still has many brilliant aspects to it. I think what really gets people down is there's not a whole lot of new territory when we look at The Final Experiment and kind of where it had come from here. Instead of taking a step forward, it kind of took a side step. And on the one hand, that's good. I mean, following up such an amazing and groundbreaking album as your debut is always hard to do, and a lot of bands struggle for that. So the fact that Ayreon and Arjen were able to produce such a work as Actual Fantasy is still quite a feat. And there are a number of really, really fantastic points on this album. One of the more popular tracks and one of the more accessible tracks being Computer Eyes. A lot of people love this song, and for really good reasons. And this song is just fantastic, and it goes all over the place. It's no question of why a lot of people love this song to the degree that they do. I love the fact that it takes its time to really build itself. And this also mirrors the album as a whole. The album takes a little bit of time to get going, and I like that, taking time to really put down the foundation and really structure the album. And Computer Eyes as a song does that as well. And so once we come into like the midpoint of the track and we have those really chugging guitars that are really bringing us into the track, it's like the guide that's leading us through a really grand cathedral of sorts. And what I also really like about this song is that synthesizer near the end point and that dance that it has with the chugging guitars. And this is where the band as a whole is starting to understand what it really means to be Ayreon. As a whole for the album, I love how this album is structured, at least. I like, as I said before, that it takes its time to get going and to really start the tracks. Actual Fantasy and Abbey of Sin, these two tracks blend really, really well together. And I like how Abbey of Sin really takes its time to develop. Like the first 2.5 minutes of this track is just the synthesizers and ambient sounds to really develop. So once we hit that like 2.5 minute mark and we get into the song, it really hits us really hard because of that build, because of that climb up that mountain. And it's funny because when I'm listening to this song, it also kind of reminds me of a lot of the riffs and a lot of the tracks from later albums. That chugging that I heard near the beginning of the song reminds me of kind of the end piece from The Human Equation. And that's something that I have noticed within the first two releases, is the seeds that were planted here and how they're blossom and grown on other tracks and other albums. And I don't know if this was intentional or if this is just Arjen's way of music. I'm wondering if he's aware that he is doing this. And so it's something that I kept kind of coming up into my mind. I'm like, is this playing homage to himself? Or is this, I don't want to say it's him running out of ideas, but just him expressing himself in that way. And this album's also a little bit heavier than the previous work. The Stranger From Within has that same kind of feeling where it's a lot heavier and we have a lot more of almost that power metal that we saw from like the early 90s. And so that was a really interesting thing. At this point of the album, because now we're 3 tracks in, I did start to notice that there's a lot of very thought out, very meticulously plotted soundscapes and music going on here. And it does feel more like a project than an actual band at this point. It feels like it is a guy in a studio really orchestrating everything and making sure that everything is in its right place. So if you're more of like a fan of that kind of off-the-cuff playing, then it could draw you out at that point, because at this point it is very, a mastermind overseeing everything and making sure everything is perfectly orchestrated. So for me, I love that. I love seeing that perfectly orchestrated piece play out, almost like a very great dance, as opposed to more of like that freestyle kind of a thing. And so it was about that. And then once we get into the Computer Eyes and then the Beyond the Last Horizon, that's where I was really starting to realize, this is, even though it's a collaboration with a number of different artists, it is still one guy overseeing the whole project. The other thing that I really enjoy about this album is the build-ups that we have and we find within it. The one that I particularly love is found within the 6th song of The Far Side of the World. Right at that middle part, it's where the song is really starting to build and really starting to build itself. And we had kind of seen a little bit of this at the beginning of the album as well as within Computer Eyes, but in this track itself, this is where we're really feeling that build-up. And I think it's at this point that Ayreon as a project realized, I can use these build-ups to emulate my heroes and get guest guitarists, keyboardists, and soloists to provide me with such meaty hooks, and I think that's where that seed was planted. And that ending of Far Side of the World is just glorious. I love that. I don't even know what it is. It really reminds me of either like a Jean-Michel Jarre or a really interesting like Pink Floydian kind of a style where it's that fast work on the synthesizer that's really playing with itself over top of one another. Something that really can't be recreated in a live venue, or if it is, it's very, I don't know, almost artificial, but I kind of like that. Now really, the highlight, the main highlight on this are the last 2 songs of Forevermore and The Dawn of Man. Forevermore, I love how intimate this song is. Unlike a lot of the songs on this where I was saying it's like overseer that's orchestrating everything, this is much more intimate and much more personal. And I think a lot of that has to do with a lot more of the acoustic instruments. You've got the harpsichord coming on here, but it's also very genuine within the sounds and within the lyrics as well. And The Dawn of Man takes that concept and kind of flips it on its head, and it does like a 360 because instead of being so intimate, now we're like really getting into almost like a computer, and it's kind of ironic that we're dealing with the dawn of man in such a computerized setting. I love the ending of the dawn of man, that play out, that build up that I was saying before. This one might be the highlight, and I love how that song plays out. So overall, Actual Fantasy, I can understand why it's a lower point of the discography of Ayreon, but if this is a low point, that's really saying something for the overall discography of the band. I thoroughly enjoyed this, and I would have to say you've got to download this if you can find it. This is a really great album, but the band has done far, far better works than this, and what I did like about this album is you can see where the seeds of better things to come are. I don't want to knock it for that, because better things to come isn't necessarily a knock on things that are. So that's where I am with this album, and one that I actually had a lot of fun diving into. So that's about it. What did you guys think of Actual Fantasy by Ayreon? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Let me know what you thought by commenting down below. And I can't wait to dive into the next album of Into the Electric Castle. I've heard this on and off, but I haven't really had a chance to really dive into it, so I'm really looking forward to that one. So stay tuned. That one's coming out in January, so look out for that. And thank you guys so much for watching. You guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.